Once a loser, always a loser. I don't believe this is true. A few weeks ago, I was at an alumni event for my university, and I met somebody from class of 1993. His name was Kurt. I only know one other person from this class. His name is Scott. And I asked Kurt, I said, do you remember somebody named Scott in your class? And it took him a second to think about it, to jog his memory. And then his face lit up and said, yeah, I remember Scott. He would always sit at the back of the class with two of his other friends. He'd be that guy who'd be at the bar on Thursday night before a test. He was a complete failure. Every single time he got the lowest score in the class. I'm surprised he even graduated. And then he told me, he said, out of everybody in the class of 1993, Scott was that guy who was probably not gonna make it. Scott was that loser. He was that person who you would never think would get anywhere, ever. And when I talked to Scott, I first met him in 2008. He told me his path to his career. He did 2 years worth of postgraduate training, and in 1995, he was unemployed. He couldn't get a job as a doctor in the 90s, and he had a family. He had kids, and his wife had to support the family for 2 years, and it wasn't until 1997 that Scott finally got another job, and he did it because he met one of his classmates at a drug rep dinner, talked with the drug rep, and the drug rep helped him get a job at a pharmaceutical company. Now, today, Scott is senior vice president and in charge of all the cancer drugs for the second largest pharmaceutical company in the world. He has an office out in Switzerland, and he also has an office here at the US affiliate. And when I told Kurt that Scott is head honcho for one of the most important therapeutic areas in medicine today, Kurt almost fell out of his chair. He thought, how could this be? Scott was a complete failure in school. He was that guy that would never amount to anything. He was a loser. He was just that guy who liked to take it easy, would never push himself anywhere. He was never going to make it. And he becomes one of the most successful and most important people at his company. Now, another story that's very similar, Joe graduated college in 1994. Now, the funny thing with Joe is that for 19 years, he was the same title, doing the same job at the same company. He told me that there was a stretch of time in his life that he just showed up to work, that there was not a lot of purpose in life, but he was there. And he said that that was what counted to him. And it wasn't until 2013 when I talked with him that just randomly, sometime in the summer, there was a company-wide announcement that Joe would assume the role of senior director, which is like 3 levels higher than where he was. And they would retro his pay back however many years. And then 6 months later after that, in January of 2014, Joe would accept a senior vice president role, yet another 2 levels above, and he would become head of the Irish affiliate for this company. As somebody who just showed up to work and didn't have much direction at all, somebody who, in the hardest of times, just kept his head down and kept moving, even if he didn't feel like he was moving forward, jumping from manager to senior vice president in 6 months at the corporate level, I don't think anybody's ever heard of that. And especially at a company with a revenue more than $40 billion. It's pretty amazing. Now, this whole thing about people being losers when they're younger, it always kind of got me, because there's a lot of bad things that you can say to a kid. And there's definitely some kids that might be watching this video. Maybe you're in high school, maybe you're in college, and you don't know where you're gonna go. And maybe there's some people getting in your ways telling you, oh, you're a fucking loser. You're never going to amount to anything. They might make fun of your accomplishments, or they might mock who you are, where you're going to go, where you're going, where you're headed in life. That's one of the most toxic things that people can say. And as a teenager or 20-year-old, or even I know some people in their 30s who are still struggling with this. There's people who actually really aren't doing that well right now. Just like Joe was for 19 years. Just like Scott was from 1995 to 1997. So the bottom line here is that what's going on now isn't what's going to be going on in a year or 2 years or 3 years. And in some cases, maybe 10 all the way up to 19 years. Now, I'll tell you this. I was born in the middle 80s, and when I formed my first memories around 1988, 1989, I remember having a cousin about 20 years old at the time, and she told me she was going to vote for George H.W. Bush in the 1988 election. Now, I didn't know who that was at the time. It was extremely common back then. Actually, the biggest base of support for Republicans was 20-year-olds back in the 80s. Now, my cousin, who's almost in her 50s now, is clearly from a different generation. They're in the generation before millennials. If you know anything about this, they're called Generation X. And they were born during the time of Roe versus Wade. They were born during the time when people were having lots of sex and they didn't want to have kids. And the kids that did come about were losers. They were the Breakfast Club. They were grunge music. They were the MTV generation. Just a set of losers that would never amount to anything. Now, I remember as a kid, I was maybe like 6 or 7 years old, at my parents' business, there would always be these kids on skateboards with their really baggy jeans and their wallet chains, and maybe they were smoking and playing with condoms. And, these were kids that were only 12, 13, 14 years old. And I remember my parents telling me, Bernard, these are really bad kids. Don't ever become them. They're losers. They're never going to get anywhere. And that was the sentiment of teenagers back in the 80s and 90s, was that this was a generation of degenerates. Now, that wasn't true in the early 2000s, where you can see that economically they were doing pretty well. But now, after the recession in 2007, 2008, they're not doing so hot. And unfortunately, this is a generation that's projected to not do very well going forward. They are doing fairly well for themselves given the circumstances of the times right now. They're doing much better than anyone ever predicted back in the 90s. If you went back to that time period, you would have thought that these people would never have been functional adults. And that's simply not true. And do you know who belongs in this generation? Scott and Joe are both in Generation X. Now, when I asked Scott what he did after he got his first job in 1997, I said, Scott, how do you go from not having a job to being a low-level person in a corporate entity to becoming a senior vice president of oncology? And he told me, he said once he got the job, he kept his head down and just kept working. That was all he had to do. He said all he needed to do was stay consistent and stay confident that his situation would keep getting better. And especially when times did not get better, he kept telling himself, it will get better, and I need to work and make it so that it does get better. When I asked Joe what he did for 19 years, sitting there doing the same job, in the same position at the same company, I said, Joe, how do you stand it for 19 years? Some of you guys watching this aren't even 19 years old. How do you do it for that long? The same thing. You're not getting anywhere. There's no progress. When there's no progress, there's no happiness. Joe told me, he said, I needed to show up every day. I did exactly what was expected of me, no more, no less. And I was confident that one day I would have something out there for me. If it wasn't a senior vice president position, which, and this is his words, he never thought he would get anyways, he said, I was living a good life. I was making good money. I had a stable job, and I was never going to leave the company. He said, no matter what, I was happy that I had a job and that I had a place to go for 8 hours a day that would pay me a check, and that check would allow me to cover my bills and do all the hobbies that I love to do. He said to him that was more than enough. And given the additional responsibilities and the consistency that he showed at work over 19 years, he ended up making it to one of the top spots in the corporate ladder. All right, with that being said, I want to leave you with this. Always be willing to do something that you didn't think that you would be. A long time ago when I was interning, I was doing free work, and it actually made me really unhappy. I didn't like the thought of not being paid for doing something for somebody else that they would get credit for and I wouldn't. I actually hated it so much I made this banner when I was a kid, and it just pissed me off so much that I was doing free work. But then somewhere down the line, when I was at Cook County Hospital, I met one of the directors of medicine over there, and she told me she was always willing to help out friends, and that she was always willing to do work for free. She was involved in the startup scene out in Chicago, and she told me, even though she was director of medicine at one of the biggest hospitals in Chicago, she would actually intern with some of the startups for free just to learn more about technology. She would go out to all of the events just to meet people, and her positive attitude just attracted more people towards her, so much so that eventually she wasn't working for free. She was doing consulting work on the side, on top of being head honcho at the Cook County Hospital. And it was the positive attitude that drew people towards her. It wasn't negativity that she was doing free work. She didn't have any resentment towards that. In fact, she even told me if she wasn't director at Cook County Hospital that she would have done the same thing, because it's something that she always wanted to learn, and it was an opportunity for her to better herself. A lot of times you might even put this limitation on yourself that you think you're a gigantic loser, that you're never going to get anywhere, that things are just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse for you. But that's not true. One of the best things that you can do is to stay confident, do things that you normally wouldn't, and try to get yourself out there. It's always the positive attitudes that draw people towards you. The negative attitudes don't last long, and we can see that even on YouTube, that there's a lot of negativity getting thrown around on this website. It doesn't last. It really doesn't last. And having a positive outlook, even in the hardest of times, that truly shows your real character. Anyways, leave a like if you enjoyed this video. I hope you did. Thanks for hanging out with me this weekend. I hope you're having a great time in school or college or work or whatever you're doing. And I will see you in the next one.